Hello everyone! In this week's horn class, we're going to start with a list of tips I call How the Pros Do It. Then I'll talk to you about my job as an assistant principal horn, what that means, how to be a good one, and how to use one effectively. After that, we'll dive deep with some discussions on how good colleagues act and how to practice healthy self-esteem. Let's jump in. So, let's say you get hired for a gig. I mean, not right now, but when it's safe to play with other musicians again. I mean, you guys are playing together right now, but not many people are booking gigs at the moment. So when that happens, let's say you get hired for a gig. Yay, that's awesome. I have a list of advice for you on how to be a pro before, during, and after that gig, so that hopefully you'll get hired again. Take notes on anything that sticks out to you. When you're asked to play a gig. When you get contacted for a gig, respond immediately after you check dates, within 24 hours. Put dates in your calendar right away. If some of the following info is not provided, ask for rehearsal times and locations, when and where you can get music, what the dress will be, and about parking if necessary. It's okay to ask how much the pay is beforehand. Sometimes you'll get paid at the gig, and sometimes you'll get paid afterward. If you really need to know when, you can ask the personnel manager. I once had a personnel manager ask me over the phone, don't you want to know how much this pays? And I was a young musician then, and honestly, I would have taken whatever work I could get. So I was like, sure, but pretty much I'm going to accept the work anyway, which that gig paid well, so there was nothing to complain about as it was. So he sort of laughed at me, and he was like, wind players never ask how much it pays. String players always ask how much it pays. And he was a string player, so I think it's fair for him to say that. So yeah, it's okay to ask. These days, most places contact you by email rather than calling, and they're going to tell you the rates in that opening email, generally. If you can make everything but one rehearsal, ask if that's okay before turning the gig down. Adam once turned down a gig because he couldn't make one rehearsal for a university function, but the tuba player who ended up playing that gig had the same university function to attend, but he just asked if he could miss the one gig rehearsal, so it never hurts to ask. Double check dates and times for the rehearsals and the performance when you put them in your calendar. And I usually double check, if not triple check, compulsively before the first rehearsal as well. Some ensembles will require you to join the union, especially around here where Denver's musician union really looks out for their musicians. So that's just something to be aware of. Preparing for the gig. Listen to the music beforehand or play along with the recording. Never sight read the first rehearsal. Be prepared. Your part should be 100% ready so that the ensemble can rehearse instead of you practicing in public. Usually only get 3 rehearsals for a concert, maybe 4. So all of the correct notes, your markings, and your equipment should be ready to go at rehearsal 1. That means knowing if you need a mute. Take good care of the music. Don't lose it. Rental parts and replacement parts are really expensive. Write lightly in pencil so the next person can erase your marks. They may want to use different markings, or the conductor may have different tempo or dynamic instructions than your conductor does. This is just a tip from me. Keep music for different gigs organized and separate from each other. Before the gig, rehearsal or performance. Always be on time. Early is on time. 30 minutes is a good benchmark for an orchestra rehearsal. 15 minutes early is too late. Please don't make the personnel manager nervous. And do not be late. You will not be rehired. Unless it's an emergency. If it's a chamber music rehearsal, be 10 to 15 minutes early. You can budget extra time for the commute. If it's at somebody's house, they might just want you to show up right on time. So just kind of play it by ear that way and be respectful. Bring all your equipment, your horn, music, pencil, mute. Unpack your case backstage and store it out of the way. And try not to unpack in somebody's regular spot if you can avoid it. If this is a new gig, introduce yourself to your new colleagues and be friendly. And just start with your own section. You're going to meet the other players eventually. Don't bother your colleagues when they're warming up. Do your crazy warm-ups before you get to rehearsal. Warming up at a gig is not for showing off. Don't warm up on solos, excerpts, or the warm-up your neighbor is doing. Also, don't use warm-up time to practice music that's not on the gig. Stay focused on what you're about to do. If there are mics involved in the setup, be courteous of the sound guys and be careful around the mics. They're super expensive and very gentle. Stay out of the way of their setup, and for mic check, sit and play exactly the way that you will for the gig. Make sure ahead of time that you have the right concert dress. Men, often that means a bow tie, clean white shirt, cufflinks and studs, shoes and matching socks, but not always. Men in my orchestra wear black shirts and ties with black sports coats. Guys should always check on dress because there's changes frequently, but for women, it's often just concert black head to toe. If it's a chamber ensemble, you may decide to dress together as a group. So a common chamber ensemble dress is like black pants and a solid colored shirt. Before the concert, double check the time it starts. Always arrive at least a half hour early. If it's a chamber music gig, ask if you need to bring a stand light, or clothespins. Outdoor performances can be windy. You can also use a piece of plexiglass instead of a clothespin. You should ask if you're going to be inside for a chamber gig. Should I bring a paper towel or something to empty my water on? During the gig, take tuning seriously. Tune yourself beforehand. The tuning note is not a time to play concert A's in every octave. It's time to listen and focus. Listen first, but don't try to match pitch by blending yours. You want to play exactly where you are. That's how you tune. You have to see the difference between where you are and where you should be. Adjust your slide if necessary, and then check your pitch again. Remember, you're going to push in if you're flat, pull out if you're sharp. If you need to use a mute and yours is tunable, try to get it done in your tuning pitch instead of using the string pitch, or just tune it to your tuner beforehand. Know when it's your turn to tune. How many A's is the orchestra going to get? Don't play on the string and woodwind A's if they have their own. Sometimes the concertmaster will hold up 2 or 3 fingers to indicate how many A's there will be. If there are 2, brass and woodwinds are together on the first A. And if there are 3, brass is usually on the second A. Play what's on the page. Don't improvise or recompose. It's tacky, it's not your job. Act in a way that earns you respect, not disrespect, and also shows that you respect the music. This is a big one. Stay off your cell phone. I used to not even bring mine on stage for rehearsal and definitely not for performances. Now I do when I play with my orchestra because I'm the union steward, so I have to watch the time for breaks. But I only use it for leisure during our off time, before the service starts, and at the service break, never while other people are playing. So that you know, people talk about musicians who are on their phone during rehearsals. It's rude and it shows you're not focused on the music. In a way, it almost comes across like you're disdainful of the music, like it's not worthy of holding your full attention. If you have a movement off, it's okay to bring a book or a magazine and maybe your cell phone, but maybe you go off stage to do that. Things are a little different if you're playing in an opera or musical pit, and whether or not you can use your phone in that situation is usually decided by the conductor based on whether or not the audience can see the glow of your screen from outside the pit. So they'll generally tell you what the policy is. This next one is one I'm sort of bad at. Play, don't talk unless it's related to the music. Focus on the business at hand. Chatter and snarky comments under your breath undermine the purpose and atmosphere of a good rehearsal. Although the comments in my section aren't snarky, they're usually just funny jokes because we tend to like cracking jokes together. And for a lot of musicians, rehearsal is basically when you see your friends. But I should behave better because you're never as quiet as you think. Conductors notice even if they don't say anything, and they might think you're making fun of them even if you're not. So yeah, be careful. Conductors are like bears. Just don't aggravate the conductors. Back away slowly. So, speaking of conductors, always listen when the conductor is talking. His or her comments may apply to you, even if they're not talking to you directly. When I'm sitting assistant and not filling in a different part further down the section, very little of what the conductor says actually applies directly to me. But if my principal misses what he said, maybe because he's discussing something with the other horns or cracking one of those jokes I was talking about, he'll turn and ask me about it, so I always try to keep my ears peeled. Never talk back to the conductor, period. I've seen people be rude to conductors in rehearsal, and if you feel like you've got something important to say, ask to speak to them after rehearsal. It just changes the whole flow of rehearsal for everyone, and it makes you look unprofessional, even if the conductor is the one being a jerk. Also, pay attention to what your colleagues are asking. Does it apply to your part as well? Speaking of your colleagues, be gracious when you address your colleagues. If you're a section player, don't demand, but ask if you want to propose issues to address with the principal of your section. And then the principal can say, yeah, let's practice that. When addressing issues, phrase it in a way that puts it on you, even if you're the principal. It's just good common courtesy. So an example of what I mean is like if you say, oh guys, can we check this spot? I think I'm not quite locked in. You don't want to say you're not locked in, right? You want to use diplomacy. So you should value and encourage a good relationship with your section, and that's just one of the ways to do that. Instead of thinking bad thoughts about your colleagues during rehearsals, focus on thinking kind thoughts. This will help you enjoy the music instead of focusing on other people's weaknesses and your own insecurities. This one's hard, but it's a good policy. If somebody treats you poorly, don't respond the same way. Be kind anyway. Listen actively across the ensemble. Well, what's my job right now? Who has the melody? Am I playing at the right volume for the melody to be heard? Who am I playing with? Are we blending? Am I playing in a 2D, as a harmony, a counter melody? Am I a bass line? What does the composer want right here? What does the conductor want right here? The conductor makes all final artistic decisions, even if you disagree. If you have a musical question, you should direct it to the principal of your section. Section players don't generally address the conductor. The principal will either make a decision for the group, or the principal will ask the conductor him or herself. If you're the principal and you have a question for the conductor, see if it can wait until break or after rehearsal. If it needs to be addressed immediately or involves other sections, those are times when it's a good idea to raise your hand and kind of interrupt the flow of rehearsal. If something within your section sounds off or needs, some consensus, ask your principal, or if you're the principal, ask the section if they wouldn't mind practicing that spot at break or after rehearsal. Just for a few minutes. If you keep your standards high within your section, then that'll make a big difference, and it's good for team morale. The principal will give instructions on where to breathe and whether to stagger or breathe together as a section, whatever is right for that situation. If you have an issue with a colleague or have an emergency, you should contact the personnel manager, not the conductor. Most musicians never have a need to talk to the conductor. Have the personnel manager's phone number handy in case you'll be late or in case of an emergency, and usually they're going to have sent that to you in the email where they contracted you for the gig. If your colleague plays something especially well, you can shuffle your feet or pat your knee to tell them good job during the performance. Certain sections and certain players like this more than others, but I say do what you feel. I always think it's better to err on the side of being more complimentary than not. And I like it when my colleagues sound good because I love it when the music sounds good. I will say that my favorite teams to play on usually have the most foot shuffling going on. Don't tap your foot too loudly or too hard to the beat. Don't conduct along or hum to the music if you can contain yourself. Sometimes it's too good though, so if you just get carried away, just try not to be too disrupted by, don't get in the way of all the great music your friends are making. Empty water in your own space. Know how long the break is and be back early. Definitely wear deodorant, but definitely don't wear perfume or cologne. Some people are really allergic, and in a wind section, that just kills everything, right? Don't try to be the loudest person in your section unless the music requires that balance. Be a team player, not a meathead. Always put the section sound and ensemble sound above your own ego. For volume, blend appropriately with the principal. At the concert, acknowledge your audience. Smile and stand for applause. Let yourself appreciate being appreciated. You brought something exciting into the audience's life. We're all realizing right now what we're missing by not being able to enjoy dozens of people making beautiful live music together for hundreds of pairs of ears, all in one place and time. It's a special experience, special for your audience, and it's special for you. And an appreciative musician will graciously accept your audience's thanks. There's going to be plenty of time later to chat with your section mates and shuffle your music after your applause dies down. Compliment your colleagues when they play something well. If they make a mistake, keep your comments to yourself. Also, don't visually or orally react to mishaps. Pretend like everything is just fine. You're just going to keep your eyes on the music or on the conductor instead of looking at the person who messed up. So also don't try to catch another colleague's eye to silently communicate about someone's mistake. That's ugly behavior. So I'm going to tell you a story that happened when I was in my senior year of high school at Interlochen. And it still cracks me up every time I think about it to this day. So we were playing Beethoven 5, which only has 2 horn parts. And, back in Beethoven's day, these would have been really small natural horns, not the big, honking horns that we have today. But we have kind of this, at the time 20th century, but now 21st century idea of how Beethoven should be played in the horn section, because we're most of the brass in Beethoven. And that idea is, this big, super big, sound. And so for that performance of Beethoven, they had doubled both of the horn parts. So we were on 1 and 2, and then there were 2 other horn players on assistant 1 and assistant 2. So everything doubled. Well, there's this one section in the first movement where you go from the exposition, which is where you are exposed to all of the themes, primary theme, secondary theme, everything that you learn about in sonata form when you're in theory class. You go from that to the development, where everything gets really stormy and kind of exciting, and it cycles through a bunch of different key areas. Well, right at the beginning of the development, the horns by themselves, nobody else in the orchestra, play the Beethoven 5 theme, but in major, right? Ba-ba-ba-bum, bum, bum. Well, so when we got to that section in the performance, we were just so excited, and we loved playing Beethoven. This was our first, experience with Beethoven. We were going to really go for it. And all 4 of us, and one of the horn players started laughing so hard. She was like, it was ridiculous. I mean, everybody knew we messed up anyway, but then she really made it obvious. So the kicker is, A couple months later, they have a radio station in Interlochen Radio. And so they play it like in the community. It's a public radio station. And so I caught a bit of that performance of Beethoven 5. And not only did that spot sound, predictably awful, because every single one of us missed all the notes, but you could hear my friend laugh in the recording as clear as day. So practice your poker face when especially when you make a mistake, but also when other people make a mistake. After the gig. Don't pack up at the end of rehearsal until you're dismissed. This sometimes takes, self-control, but you can spare the extra 90 seconds in your life just to, give a little respect to what you're there for. Turn in your music promptly after the concert. The orchestra will be fined if rental parts are not returned on time, and it's expensive if you lose one. Don't talk crap about other musicians. If you want to get hired around town in the future, then say nice things. The music community is small and news travels fast. Okay, let's switch over to talking about one of the most interesting aspects of the horn section, the use of an assistant horn. In orchestras that want to play heavier rep or longer or more frequent concerts, there will often be a regular fifth seat in the horn section. That position will be called assistant principal or assistant utility. That person shares the first horn part with the principal horn. In a section with an assistant, the assistant will sit to the left of the principal. So the order will go, I'm not sure which way you're looking, this is my left, assistant, first, second, third, fourth. Or maybe you have third and fourth back behind assistant, first, and second if the horns are set up in a box. The assistant's part is marked by the principal horn. If you want to be a responsible and respectful principal, mark the assistant part before the first rehearsal. So the assistant's not trying to guess when they're supposed to come in based on a kick or an elbow. That's considered kind of old school these days, and it shows a lack of preparation on the principal's part. It also really ruins the first rehearsal for the assistant and the principal because there's no way for the assistant to rehearse as you would perform if you don't even know where you're supposed to come in. And because the principal has to multitask instead of really being able to focus on, their own part. Usually you'll mark what the assistant plays using brackets. So an opening bracket like this, and then you'll see a closing bracket when the principal takes back over. The principal will mark those in their part, and then the assistant can use that to mark their own part. So they'll use that principal part as a guide. If parts are marked ahead of time, maybe one or two adjustments might end up being made during the first rehearsal based on if the principal wants to change anything. But after that, the parts are pretty much set, and the principal no longer plays the music marked out for assistant. So, what are some reasons that a principal might mark out a part for their assistant to play? To give the principal a face break during passages that pose an endurance challenge. To let the principal take a breath without a break in the sound so that the assistant sneaks in and out on a long note to cover that breath. To have the assistant take over on long held notes or repetitive ostinato passages. And ostinato is just like a repetitive background theme. To double the principal on loud horn tooties. In that case, I would write the word both over that bracketed section, or sometimes you'll see people write A2, which means two players. Likewise, to double the bottom horns for balance on full section passages that are written in octaves. For this, I might write 8VB above that section, which means an octave below. If you wrote 8VA, that would mean an octave above. Spots that should not be marked for the assistant. Solos. Spots where the principal is leading the style for the whole section. Places where the horn is part of a smaller chamber music orchestration, like a wind quintet configuration. How much do I expect to play as an assistant? In dense, heavy music, maybe 1 to 2 big sections per page. And if we're talking about the last movement of a symphony, I might end up playing 80% of that movement, since last movements are usually pretty loud and rhythmic and not soloistic and exposed. Now, in more sparse music, I might have 1 to 2 small passages per movement, or maybe even get the whole slow movement off. So, what are the duties involved with being a good assistant horn? Provide extra power to the tutti parts. Match horn 1 in tone and volume in trade-off passages so that hopefully the audience can't tell that you switched. To lead the section when you take over. I played assistant to a grad student for my whole freshman year at Northwestern University, and it was fantastic. She told me, when you're playing, you are the principal horn, so you don't have to hide, play out and lead. Not only do you have to be in that frame of mind, but the assistant is often separated from the rest of the section by the principal horn. So you also have to be capable of leading and projecting that leadership from a distance. It's your duty to blend and come in gradually if taking over a note from the principal. It's also your duty to fill in for the other horns in the section if they sub off that concert cycle or in case of emergency. So an assistant needs to be able to play in all registers, to have great sight reading skills, and to have basically nerves of steel to fill in at a moment's notice on a part you may have not prepared. This includes filling in for principal, though you should have prepared that part at least. Either maybe because it's an emergency or because the principal took the concert cycle off. In some orchestras, the third horn will be named as associate horn, meaning that they get the first right to fill in as principal if the principal takes off a concert cycle with advance notice. And then if they're not available, then the assistant will fill in as principal for that cycle. That's how my orchestra works. In other orchestras, the assistant may be called assistant/associate and always play principal when the principal is absent, and that's common in some of your really big orchestras. Another duty of being an assistant horn is to come in cold after long rests, often playing extreme dynamics. So more than figuring out face logistics, this is more a matter of focus and trust that what you want to come out of your bell will, even if you've been sitting for 20 minutes without playing. I mean, tuba players do it all the time. It's also your duty to count and keep track of rests. Don't check out. This requires a lot of focus, especially since sometimes it's so tempting to switch into audience mode and just enjoy the show. So I very consciously switch back and forth from listening mode to playing mode. So what are the duties involved in being a good principal to your assistant? I should say these are not statements against my principal, just a list of good policies based on mistakes that I've seen made over the years. Don't be stingy. Give your assistant some interesting music to play. They're there to help you sound better, so sidelining them is not doing you any favors. And the downside to that is I have definitely seen situations where a principal didn't give away enough of the kind of inconsequential, loud and high stuff to their assistant, which I totally get. That stuff is really fun to play. I get to play a lot of it, but that never ends well, especially if there are some soft or exposed parts, maybe a solo toward the end of a really long concert. On the other hand, don't just give your assistant something interesting to play because you chose it on a whim. If you don't do your homework and listen to the piece with your part while you mark it, you might give away something that's pretty soloistic without realizing it. Then you'll look kind of dumb, and your assistant looks dumb because they're playing something the principal should have played. So if you listen to the piece and mark your part, or you can even just glance at the score online at IMSLP, and you don't even have to listen to a whole hour-long piece, then you're going to make more informed, intelligent decisions about how your part should be distributed between the two of you. Don't jump in on a part marked for your assistant just for fun, unless you're planning to remark that part, and I've seen a lot of student principal horn players do this. It's so rude. You would never jump in and play horn 4's part just because you have cues and it looks like fun. So don't do that to your assistant once you've marked their part. And most importantly, mark your parts in advance so that you and your assistant get an actual first rehearsal just like everyone else. Good collegiality. You may have noticed that a lot of my how the pros do it tips concern being a good colleague to the people you work with. I wish I could say that this is how it works in every horn section across the world, but truthfully, it most often doesn't. And that's not exactly accurate. Most people are really good colleagues, especially most horn players. But some people at being a musician go to their head, and they may act like they're above other musicians. There's another group of musicians who may feel inadequate, which can cause them to act as if their egos are as big as the first group of people I mentioned. A third group of musicians, maybe the largest group, also feel inadequate and begin to subconsciously berate themselves until they feel beaten down and maybe even lose their affection for playing because it becomes a source of emotional pain. So the last two groups I mentioned, the insecure, can be helped. The truly egotistical may be beyond modern science. I don't know. At least I don't know how to help them. As I like to tell people, I blow raspberries into plumbing all day for a living. There's just nothing so fancy about what we do that we should feel like we're better than anybody else. I mean, I literally leave my spit on the floor, just like the next gal. My path to healthier self-esteem as a player started with being a good colleague, listening with kind ears, giving earnest compliments, and remembering that any mistake could have been mine. This is especially important as brass players age because what we do can't always be physically done at the highest level well into our golden years. So here are the beautiful things that people play, not their mistakes. If you're listening for mistakes, then you're not listening to the music, you're listening to the performance. And that means that you've appointed yourself the judge of that performance, judge of your colleagues. And since mistakes happen, you'll start to find that you experience mistakes and start to judge yourself. And your experience, playing music just might become hollow and lacking because there's never going to be a perfect concert. But through listening to the beautiful things that your colleagues play, you get to enjoy the true intention of the music, and you can even get lost in it. It's not always easy to achieve that frame of mind when you're playing with a group, but whenever I can, I always leave a rehearsal or performance so happy, just glowing happy. I feel like the music can just soak into me because I'm thinking kind, open thoughts about my friends, and I'm getting rid of any ugly thoughts that block my pleasure. And then I can feel more confident about adding my own voice to that amazing group of musicians. The more I practice thinking kind thoughts about my colleagues, the more I'm able to think kind thoughts towards myself. For lots of people, it's much easier to be a good colleague first, then use that experience to learn to be a good colleague to yourself. This can help you start to become a member of the fourth group of musicians, those who are, teetering but mentally balanced. They see and work on their shortcomings, but they can still maintain a healthy self-esteem. And it is maintained, it takes work. But it all starts with how you treat others. So this transitions well into a talk about good self-esteem. Many musicians have very negative self-talk inside their heads. We're critical thinkers because we're always trying to improve ourselves. But that can easily get to the point where all we hear are the negative thoughts in our heads, causing us to ignore all of the great sounds or positive improvements that we've made. I've had students tell me thoughts before that they have about themselves, which are so unkind that they would never have those thoughts about people, even people they didn't like. Like, I'm the worst, I'm terrible, I'll never go anywhere, And you know what? I've had those thoughts about myself too. But when I hear those thoughts or think those thoughts, I like to say, would you say that to your mom or your dad? Would you say that to your brother or your sister? And would they say those things to you? You should treat yourself at least as kindly in your own mind as you would treat your family to their face. Thinking kindly toward yourself is not the same as being egotistical. As I said before, in my experience, a lot of people who are outwardly egotistical are secretly insecure and fearful of what other people think of their talents. These people often crave compliments because they feel like they can't validate themselves. But something that tends to be true of people who are insecure more outwardly is that they may feel guilty about giving themselves compliments. Almost like the self-critique feels productive, but the self-congratulatory thoughts feel indulgent. Well, I'm about to give you a scientific reason to indulge in your self-congratulatory thoughts when you do something well. Our brain has what's called a negativity bias. By our very nature, we place 4 times more emphasis on negative thoughts than we do on positive thoughts. And the same thing with events. We think about negative events 4 times more than we do about positive events. This is probably a development that was meant to help us with problem solving for survival and to remind us of bad things that had happened so that we could protect ourselves, like back in the caveman and cave lady days. But when applied to situations that aren't exactly life-threatening, it's overkill to think negative thoughts 4 times as much as positive thoughts. It can lead to a real imbalance in our mental and emotional lives, especially if we're indulging in so many negative thoughts about something that we really care about, like playing an instrument. So, I like to encourage my students after a performance to think about the good things they liked about their playing 4 times more than the bad things. And I try to do this myself. It's not that I'm trying to puff myself up, I'm just trying to even myself out. Trust me, I am not going to forget what went wrong. That will not be a problem. But I might forget something that went awesome if I don't play it over in my head a few times to think about how much I enjoyed it. And then I leave the concert feeling great instead of feeling defeated, even if I make mistakes, which I almost certainly did. Especially when he was a younger musician, Adam could be super self-critical. He likes to live in that constructive feedback space and exhibits almost a craving for critique. But after a period of time, that single-minded approach can be very damaging because it's lopsided. When he's feeling really down about his playing or he's prepping for an audition and doing a lot of recording and listening, I suggest an exercise to him that's purely for self-esteem and not about playing at all. I tell him to listen back to his recordings, but to write only compliments. Again, this isn't for his ego, it's a counterbalance to his constant focus on the things that he wants to improve. This is an exercise that encourages you to open your ears to the good sounds you're making and prioritizes the progress you hear over our desire to achieve the unachievable, which is perfection. Remember that people want you to play well, right? Everyone wants to be entertained. They want being an audience member to be easy. Convince yourself that the audience is full of teammates, not enemies. There will definitely be people who will judge you, and there will definitely be people who will come up to you and talk to your face about notes you missed. I know it sounds crazy, but they're out there. But those people aren't listening to the music. They're only listening to the performances. Remember that what you do is to serve Beethoven, Brahms, and Bruckner, not your own ego or the audience's desire to fact check your performance. If you want to be a horn player who is mentally balanced, then you must accept the following statement. The search for perfection will always be fruitless. If perfection is your primary goal, you will always fail. In fact, it's often when you're trying not to miss notes that you miss the most notes because your focus is in the wrong place. Reorient your goals toward sharing and honoring the music. In this way, you also honor the audience and yourself by acknowledging that you're not the show, the music is the show. So, what do you do and how should you feel if you make a big mistake in performance? Or even if you make a big mistake in rehearsal and embarrass yourself in front of your friends? This is very important, maybe the most important thing you can learn from me. When you make a mistake, forgive yourself right away. I'm going to say that one more time. When you make a mistake, you forgive yourself right away. This is the only way to stay focused on what you're doing and not on what happened in the past. That doesn't mean that you'll forget about the mistake that you made. Again, that's unlikely. You're still going to go home and you're going to practice the skills that'll help you nail it the next time. But getting unproportionately upset or holding a grudge against yourself in the moment is the exact recipe for a crash and burn. Weird story for you. When I was younger, I took piano lessons, and I was maybe 15 years old when I was asked to play piano at an honor recital in Huntsville, where John's from. And piano was never really my main interest, but my teacher wanted me to play this challenging piece memorized, so I worked really hard for this performance. I don't remember getting up on stage or starting the piece, but I do remember getting to this one bar and immediately forgetting what came next. So what was I really thinking about? I was thinking about the audience. I had played concerts all my life. I'd played choir, I'd been in, played piano, played French horn, but that was the moment I noticed the audience and my brain just froze. I remember backing up a few bars and trying to sort out what came next in that spot. But after a couple of tries, I just stood up and left the stage. I mean, there's no way I was more than a page and a half in to a 5-6 page piece. So what's weird about that story? Number one, I didn't remember it happened to me until probably 20 years later. I'd been managing my stage fright for years, wondering where it came from because I remember not feeling that way. And then one day I remembered that this happened, and I said, oh, this is why performing scares me. It was like a literal nightmare. And number two, the high school teacher that John and I shared, Ms. Dory Nutt, who we both adore, asked me to come back to Alabama to play a recital and give a master class to her college horn students a few years ago. Well, guess which auditorium I performed in? The same place that this experience happened that I had repressed for years. So it was neat to come back and have an enjoyable performance on the instrument I really cared about. Totally full circle. All that to say, now I know how to handle a mistake differently. I know how to focus on what I'm doing and zone out the audience. I know how to create positive thoughts so that I'm not in the crash and burn, feeling bad about yourself zone to begin with. All that to say, you can manage stage fright. It can get better. There's hope. We're going to talk down the road about specific techniques you can put into place in the weeks, days, and hours before a performance to keep your nerves constructive instead of destructive. But today, we're going to talk about the first stop, which is feeling good deep down about yourself overall. I want to talk to you about a book that my teacher Steve at the University of Utah introduced me to. It's called Feeling Good by Dr. David Burns. That was his original text, though I really prefer the workbook version, 10 Days to Self-Esteem. Feeling Good was one of the first self-help books back in the 1980s, but Dr. David Burns, he doesn't write for Cosmo, he's a licensed psychiatrist. He has a podcast even now, the Feeling Good podcast, where he and another doctor discuss how to use his techniques with their patients. So he's still very active in the therapy field. Back in the mid-70s, Dr. Burns was treating patients using other traditional therapeutic philosophies, but he noticed that his patients weren't really getting any better, and that started to bother him. So he began to work with the techniques of Aaron Beck, who was an early proponent of this philosophy called cognitive behavioral therapy. When he noticed his patients improving through using this type of therapy, he started to develop a method of testing how they felt in the moment so that they could see their own progress from day to day. And he developed a method for dealing with what he called distorted thoughts, which I'm going to teach you shortly. I saw an interesting statement about this on Dr. Burns's wiki article that sums up cognitive behavioral therapy in a nutshell. It says, the basic concept behind cognitive therapy goes all the way back to Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, one I've never heard of. Nearly 2,000 years ago, he wrote that people are disturbed not by things, but by the views we take of them. In other words, our thoughts, our cognitions, create all of our feelings. Thus, when we make healthy changes in the way we think, we experience healthy changes in the way that we feel. So the basic premise of this philosophy of therapy is that when something happens to me, that is not what caused my feelings about it. I actually chose how to feel about that thing by choosing my thoughts. So the thing that happened did not cause my emotions, it's the way that I thought about it that did. When my teacher introduced me to the idea, it was to help to work on stage fright, and it was such a revelation to me. I realized your emotions are changeable, and I know that's true because I could think two ways about the same thing just by changing my mind about it, and I had never realized that before. And the way that you change your emotions is by changing the thoughts around those emotions. There are 3 steps to this process. First, and this may be the hardest, you have to start consciously hearing your negative thoughts in the first place. Sometimes they bubble so far under the surface that it's all subliminal and we don't really hear the mean things we're saying to ourselves about ourselves. I once had a student write down every negative thought he had for a whole week just to see how many he collected, and it was a lot. Then we learned the technique I'm about to teach you so that he had a tool to counter those negative thoughts. Step 2, after identifying your negative thought and writing it down, Dr. Burns says you always have to write it down, by the way. It's not as effective if you do this in your head. Then you look at his list of distorted thoughts and write down which ones apply to your thought. These distorted thoughts are the types of thoughts that bring on negative emotions. So let's take a look at this list. Number 1 is all or nothing thinking, meaning that you look at things in absolute black and white categories. So if you said something like, I'm the worst, then you think it sounds like subliminally to your brain, you're 100% bad and there's no good in you. That's all or nothing thinking. Or that, maybe you get placed low in your placement audition, and so you end up playing fourth horn, and you think, this is terrible. I feel so embarrassed. But then you find out, that you really like fourth horn, or you really like low horn playing. Well, that all or nothing thinking before told you this was a terrible thing. And actually, maybe it turns out that, some things that are bad are also have good parts about them. So, number 2, overgeneralization. You view a negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. This is a hard one for musicians. Like, I lost an audition. Man, if you're a professional musician, you're going to lose way more auditions than you win. So, if you saw one loss as a never-ending pattern of defeat, you might just say, I'm done. But what we're learning here is that that's a distorted thought, that one loss means that you're always going to lose. So that can be countered, and it doesn't mean that it's true. Number 3, mental filter. You dwell on the negatives and ignore the positives. So this is one I think about whenever I do the example. Nobody likes me, right? First of all, you're probably thinking about 1 or 2 people who you feel like don't like you, who you want to like you. But think about all the people who do like you, all your friends, all your family, people who you just, chat with at the store when, you go buy your groceries. So that's dwelling on the negatives and ignoring the positives. And number 4, discounting the positives, which is kind of a shade of that mental filter. You insist that your accomplishments or positive qualities don't count. So this is one that Adam brings up for me sometimes when I'm, thinking about, I'm scared to take this audition. And he's like, well, think about your history of success, right? Think about the things that you have gone, well for you in the past. Don't insist that your accomplishments or positive qualities don't count. Number 5, jumping to conclusions. You conclude things are bad without any definitive events. There's some a couple of subcategories down here, but just the kind of overall idea. Let's think about, you take your pull audition, your placement audition at school, and you play it, and then you leave, and you're like, oh, that was terrible. I'm going to be placed dead last. Right? That's kind of jumping to conclusions. So you're indulging in a thought. You don't know what's going to happen, right? You don't know how everybody else played. So what that really tells you is, okay, there's things I need to work on with my audition process. Let's see what subcategories that might apply to that. So mind reading, you assume people are reacting negatively to you. So maybe you assume that whoever's listening to your audition is reacting negatively to it. Or fortune telling, you predict that things will turn out badly. You predict you're gonna, do, the worst you could imagine doing. So that's jumping to conclusions. You can see that a lot of these have, qualities in common. So when you're picking the distorted thoughts that are gonna apply to your negative thought, a lot of times you're gonna have more than one of these apply. So number 6, magnification or minimization. You blow things way out of proportion, or you shrink their importance. Like, people, this is a weird example to think of, but people do this sometimes with their music director. Like their music director, writes them a short email, and they're like, oh, you must be upset with me, blah, blah, blah. Probably he's just trying to get through a lot of email, right? So that's magnification, that kind of thing. Emotional reasoning. You reason from how you feel. I feel like an idiot, so I must be one. I feel like such a loser. I must be a loser, right? So kind of label yourself that way based on your emotions rather than, than your actual acts. And, like that you're a good person to your friends, a good person to your family, that you're diligent with your work, and etc. Number 8, should statements. You criticize yourself or other people with shoulds, shouldn'ts. Oh, but I should have done better at that test, Oh man, I shouldn't have to do this, I don't know, or they shouldn't have done that. I don't know. So the should statements where you're kind of saying, this is what I expected from myself, or this is what I expected from somebody else, and I didn't live up to that expectation, and therefore I'm not worthy, right? That's what that spins out to sometimes. Number 9, labeling. Instead of saying, I made a mistake, you tell yourself, I'm a jerk, or I'm a loser. So I mentioned labeling up when I said emotional reasoning. So those are kind of connected. And then number 10, blame. You blame yourself for something you weren't entirely responsible for, or you blame other people and overlook ways that you contributed to making a problem happen. So that's a distorted thought, to blame somebody else and not take the blame for yourself, or to blame yourself entirely, especially if it's not your thought, you know. And we think a lot about this sometimes with people who have been, you know, victimized in some way. Like maybe your grandma, you know, bought into some, you know, scam and lost a bunch of money, and she feels terrible when, you know, how is she to know? It's not her fault. It's the fault of the people who did something bad to her. So then she takes that on herself, you know, and that's it'll lead to feeling emotionally imbalanced about it. So we're going to learn some ways to counter these thoughts now. Now, Dr. Burns says you should create a new, more objective thought that is free of distortions and feels deep down like it's true to you. So let's do an example of this exercise together. Dr. Burns has uploaded this, or has this little chart that I've uploaded for you. Let's use the negative thought, I'm the worst horn player in the world. One of the things about negative thoughts is that sometimes just writing them down on paper makes them look ridiculous and already takes some of the power away from them. So if you write that on paper, I'm the worst horn player in the world, it'll probably already feel ridiculous. So let's look at our distorted thoughts chart. What applies to this negative thought? Well, definitely all or nothing, because in this case, we're literally calling ourselves nothing. Is it overgeneralization? Maybe not directly, but possibly related. Is it mental filter? Maybe not, but that could have led to this thought. Is it disqualifying the positive? Definitely. If you think you're the worst horn player in the world, you're definitely disqualifying your positives. Jumping to conclusions, not so much. Mind reading, no. Fortune telling, no. Magnification, definitely yes. Emotional reasoning, I am this label, therefore I, feel like I am this label, therefore I am, so yeah. Should statements, perhaps that's implied that you should be the best horn player in the world, maybe. Judging, most certainly. So that's 5 definite distortions that we found in that thought, and a lot of the others kind of danced around it. So can you think of a more objective thought? I'll give you a bit of time on this one on your own, and then I'll give you some ideas. So how about, there's no way I can be the worst horn player in the world. I've heard beginners. Maybe that's not the most uplifting thought, but it does feel true. How about, maybe I'm not the best horn player in the world, but I'm working hard at being my best, and I get better at that every day. To me, that feels a lot more encouraging and a lot more true to healthy goals, being your best instead of the best. You can use this tool for many purposes in your personal life if you feel low or upset, or anytime you feel nervous or scared of a performance, for example. Try to catch the thought that's making your brain spin and use this technique to put it to the test and see if it really objectively makes sense. Again, here are those 3 steps. Number 1, identify the thought. Number 2, identify the distortions in that thought. And then number 3, create a more objectively true thought. We're going to work with this again later in the semester when we talk about auditions. Here is your attendance assignment for this week. If you have Sean for lessons, you'll have a different assignment than my lesson students. So for Sean's students, this week you're going to write 3 honest things that you like about your horn playing and send them to Sean. For my students, we're going to do the second step of our etude composition. We're going to improvise. So, take your list of parameters that you chose and put it on the stand in front of you. If you're in a particular key signature, maybe you want to play that scale first, play through it just to kind of familiarize yourself with the flats or sharps that you're going to have. Turn on a 5-minute timer in your recording device, and using just your horn and your brain, just play around with those ideas for 5 minutes. Nothing is going to be perfect. I'm not expecting that. Try some ideas that have different moods. You don't need a whole song, just some ideas. A slow, pretty idea, a fast, bouncy idea, sad idea, happy idea. Nothing needs to be a melody or flow together or build on each other. We're just looking for 5 minutes of random ideas that fit within the guidelines you picked out last time and that we talked about in your lesson. And then send me your recording.